In the wilderness, survival is all about life or death. Over the years, trappers, hunters, and pioneers mastered the wild. They built shelter in minutes, set traps that fed them through brutal winters, and traveled hundreds of miles through uncharted wilderness with nothing but instinct and experience to guide them. Today, most of these techniques have faded into history, lost in a world of modern convenience. But out here, in the untamed wild, those skills meant everything. In this episode, we're bringing them back. 7 forgotten survival techniques that kept mountain men alive. If you ever find yourself out in the wilderness, some of these could save your life. As for the others, you'll wonder how anyone ever pulled them off. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Now, let's get started with 1. Beaver trapping with primitive lures. You see, mountain men didn't just trap beavers for profit. These animals were survival gold. Fur for warmth, meat for food, and one of the most valuable trade goods on the frontier. But catching a beaver wasn't as simple as tossing a trap in a creek. These weren't clueless rodents, mind you. They were smart, cautious, and built like underwater tanks. If a trapper wanted one, he had to outthink it. That's where caster lure came in. Forget store-bought bait. Mountain men made their own, and it was potent. They harvested castor glands straight from the base of a beaver's tail, squeezing out the thick, musky liquid these animals used to mark their territory. Then they mixed it with whatever they could get their hands on: nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and a healthy dose of alcohol, until it became a bitter, almost mustard-like paste. This was a challenge. Any beaver catching a whiff would think some rival had staked a claim nearby. That's all it took. Instinct kicked in, and before long, the beaver was nosing around, looking to defend its turf, right into the waiting jaws of a steel trap. Trappers carried their homemade bait in a hollowed-out cherry limb, plugged at both ends and tied to their belts or powder horns. It was one of the few things they never left camp without. Unfortunately, trapping is a dying art, and the knowledge of how to read a beaver's habits, find its runs, and lure it with handcrafted bait has nearly vanished. And today, only a handful of hardcore survivalists and old-school trappers know how to do it from scratch. Regulations have made trapping a lost trade, and unless you're deep in the wild, odds are you've never even seen a real beaver trap in action. But back then, if you wanted to stay alive, warm, and fed, you either learned the trick or you froze. And with that said, let's move on to 2. Crafting buckskin clothing for survival. Now, one thing you ought to know is that a mountain man didn't wear fancy fabric or store-bought coats. Cotton shirts and wool blankets had their place, but when it came to real survival in the wild, nothing beat buckskin. It was tough, warm, and, if tanned right, soft as butter. It shed rain, blocked wind, and let a man move through thick brush without making a sound. More than just clothing, buckskin was survival gear, and a man who knew how to make it could live through just about anything. To skin and prep the hide, first you needed a fresh deer hide. Mountain men weren't picky about where they got one, either from a kill, a trade with natives, or stripping it off a carcass before the wolves had their way with it. Once skinned, the real work began. That hide still had flesh hanging to it, and if left to rot, it would harden like a board. So you threw it over a log or stretched it tight on a frame and got to scraping. A dull knife, a sharpened bone, or even the edge of an old trap worked fine. The goal is to strip every last bit of fat and membrane off without cutting through the hide itself. Now, every animal has just enough brains to tan its own hide, except for some men, of course. You took the brains, mashed them up with warm water, and worked the mixture deep into the fibers. This broke down the stiffness and made the hide flexible. Some trappers added liver or eggs to the mix, but brains worked best. If you didn't have any, you could trade for a sack of animal brains with the local tribes, assuming they didn't think you were insane for not having any of your own. and after soaking in the brain mixture, the hide was wrung out and stretched, pulled over a wooden beam, and worked by hand until it was soft and dry. Then came the crucial step, smoking. You see, a raw tanned hide was soft, but if it got wet, it turned stiff again. Smoking solved that. You dug a small fire pit, threw in rotten wood or punky logs, and let them smolder. The goal was thick, heavy smoke, not flames. The hide was sewn into a loose sack, covered over the fire, and left to absorb the smoke for hours. This kept it flexible and gave it that deep, earthy scent that lasted for years. Once smoked, the buckskin was ready to be cut and stitched. No sewing machines here, just an awl, some sinew, and patience. Mountain men wore buckskin shirts, pants, and moccasins, all stitched by hand. Some added fringes, not just for show, but to help rainwater wick away. Others reinforced the elbows and knees with extra layers to keep from wearing through too fast. Overall, wearing buckskin makes one feel warm in winter, cool in summer, and nearly silent in the woods. But it had one major flaw. It soaked up smells like a sponge. If a man spent too much time around campfires, he reeked of smoke. If he spent too much time in the rain, he smelled like a wet dog. And if he skipped a river bath too long, well, let's just say a grizzly might not be able to tell the difference. Still, for a mountain man, buckskin was a second skin, one that could mean the difference between life and death in the wild. And a man who knew how to craft it? Well, let's just say he was one step ahead of the cold, the wind, and anything else the frontier threw his way. Next we have 3. Building and using self-made bullboats. When a mountain man needed a boat, he didn't go shopping. He built one, fast. One of the most practical and nearly forgotten survival skills was crafting a bullboat, which is a small, round watercraft made from a buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame. It wasn't elegant, but it got the job done. These basic little vessels helped mountain men cross rivers, haul furs, and even set traps in deep waters. To build one, first you needed willow branches, and they had to be thin, flexible, and strong. You bent them into a rough circular or oval frame, lashing them together at the joints with rawhide, or whatever was available. The result looked like a giant upside-down basket. It was wobbly, but sturdy enough once covered. Next came the buffalo hide. Ideally, you'd have a fresh one, but let's be real. Most trappers weren't in the business of waiting around for the perfect hide. You stretched it tight over the frame, fur side inward, and lashed it down with more rawhide. Some men would smoke or grease the hide to keep it from soaking up water, but in a pinch, you just hoped for the best. Once dry, the hide tightened around the frame like a drum. The result would have been a round, floating tub that could carry a man, his rifle, and a load of beaver pelts. They weren't pretty, they weren't fast, and they sure as hell weren't stable, but they worked. Now, paddling a bullboat was an exercise in frustration. Since it was round, the damn thing spun in circles if you didn't paddle just right. A smart trapper would kneel near the edge and use short, steady strokes with a paddle, or even just his hands. Some even tied themselves to their cargo in case they flipped, because, let's face it, they were going to flip. Still, bullboats were lifesavers. They let trappers move their hauls downriver instead of hauling heavy loads overland. They also gave mountain men a way to cross fast-moving rivers without getting swept away or losing valuable furs. Unfortunately, today, if you need a boat, you buy one. No one's out in the wilderness stitching buffalo hides over willow frames anymore. But for the men who lived and died by the rivers, knowing how to make a boat from nothing could mean the difference between survival and drowning. Let's move on to 4, navigating rivers without modern maps. A mountain man didn't have a GPS. Hell, he didn't even have a decent map most of the time. What he had was his eyes, instincts, and a hard-earned knowledge of the land. He read the rivers like a seasoned gambler reads a deck of cards, watching currents, tracking water levels, and knowing damn well that one wrong move could send him straight to the bottom. Rivers were the lifeblood of the fur trade, cutting through the wilderness like winding highways. A good trapper knew how to use them for drinking, fishing, and even for traveling deep into the mountains and back out with a pack full of pelts. The key is understanding the water before it understood you. You see, the Missouri, the Platte, the Snake, the Green, each river had its own traits, and mountain men knew them like the backs of their rough hands. They read the color and speed of the water to tell if snowmelt was flooding the banks or if hidden sandbars were waiting to rip a boat apart. For instance, if the water was clear but moving fast, then this means the river had a deep, reliable current, but one that could drag a careless traveler into trouble. A smart mountain man worked with the river instead of fighting it. He knew when to push forward, when to drift, and when to haul his gear out, and hoof it along the bank instead of wasting energy paddling against an unstoppable force. And not every river crossing was smooth sailing. Sometimes a trapper had no choice but to swim his way across, gear and all. That's where knowing the river's tricks became the difference between reaching the other side or turning into fish food. For instance, one must always keep watch for deadheads. Half-sunken logs that looked harmless could actually smash a skull or drag a man under. And if a man misjudged the current, then he'd better hope someone was downstream with a rope, or that he could grab onto a low-hanging branch before the river swallowed him whole. To increase your chances for survival, sometimes it's better to strip down before crossing. Wet buckskins weigh a man down like a sack of rocks. Better to cross in nothing but a breechclout, carrying your gear overhead. Also, use your rifle as a float. Wrap it in your blanket, tie it tight, and keep it above the water. A wet rifle was a useless rifle, and most importantly, never cross alone if you can help it. A strong swimmer could haul a weaker man across, or at least drag his body back if things went south. With that said, let's move on to 5. Fire, starting with flint and steel in harsh conditions. Fire meant life. No fire means no warmth. No warmth means you're a frozen carcass by morning. Mountain men knew this. A man without fire in the Rockies was as good as dead. To survive, they carried their fire-making tools like they carried their rifles, always within reach. A flint, a steel striker, and a pouch of dry tinder were essential. No fancy matches, no lighters, just basic skill and a good strike of steel against stone. As for the process, first they pulled out their char cloth, which are blackened scraps of linen burned just enough to catch a spark but not turn to ash. In the case of no char cloth, they made do with dry fungus, crumbled bark, or even fine wood shavings. Anything that could smolder, they placed this in a small tinder nest, which consisted of dried grass, moss, or shredded bark, shaped like a bird's nest to hold the ember. Then came the strike. A good steel striker against flint sent out hot, bright sparks. These are tiny embers that are looking for something to bite. When one caught, they didn't waste time. They blew on it, slowly, feeding it air, watching as the tiny glow spread. The trick was patience. Blow too hard, you snuff it out. Too soft, it fades. Just right, and suddenly the tinder nest erupts into flame. And that was the moment of truth. A weak fire meant struggling all night, barely keeping warm. A good fire meant comfort, safety, and a way to cook. The biggest challenge here is wet weather. Rain and snow turned fire starting into a nightmare. Dry tinder was everything. Smart trappers stashed some in a pouch or under their coat, knowing they might need it after a river crossing or a storm. As for the greenhorns who didn't, they'd be fumbling in the dark, cursing the cold, hands numb, watching their breath fog up as they failed over and over. Once again, a fireless night could kill you. The grizzlies, the wolves, the cold, they all waited for the man foolish enough to be caught without flame. And now, get ready for 6. Making and using pemmican for long-term food storage. Pemmican was the mountain man's insurance policy. When the beaver were scarce, the buffalo had moved on, or winter locked down the land, pemmican kept a man alive. It was more than just food. It was survival, packed dense with fat, protein, and calories to keep a body moving through the worst conditions. The recipe was brutally simple: lean meat, rendered fat, and dried berries. No fancy spices, no delicate cooking, just pure, basic survival in a form that wouldn't spoil, rot, or turn rancid. Properly made, pemmican could last years. That's right, not months, not seasons, but years, without refrigeration, preservatives, or any of the nonsense we rely on today. First things first, buffalo was best. Elk and deer worked fine. Even beaver, if a man was desperate. The key was drying it right. No moisture meant no rot. Mountain men either air-dried strips of meat in the sun or smoked them over low fires until they were weak enough to snap. If it bent, it wasn't ready. Once dried, the meat was pounded into powder, either with a rock, a rifle butt, or anything that got the job done. The finer the grind, the better it mixed. The next step was fat. Fat was gold. It carried the calories, sealed the mixture, and kept hunger at bay. Rendered fat, or tallow, was the only way to make pemmican last. You see, fresh fat would spoil fast, so it had to be slowly melted down, strained, and left to cool into a thick, waxy substance that could be stored and transported. Without it, the powdered meat was just dust. And then comes the mixing. The ground meat was packed into a container such as rawhide bags, hollowed-out bones, or whatever worked, and the hot tallow was poured over it. Some added dried berries for a bit of variety or to hide the gamey taste. Everything was mixed together until it became a heavy, compact brick. And for storage purposes, pemmican was shaped into flat cakes or rolled into fist-sized balls, then stored in rawhide pouches, pressed and sealed. No mold, no rot, no nonsense. A slab of pemmican could be eaten as is, cooked into a stew, or fried in its own fat for a makeshift meal. Mountain men carried it because it lasted longer than any hunt and weighed next to nothing for the amount of energy it provided. Now the main reason why this technique was forgotten is because modern food is soft. Because people don't have to think about food running out. Because nobody today knows what it's like to be stranded in the wild with nothing but a knife and the hope that something edible crosses their path. Pemmican was all about outlasting the wilderness, and it worked. Speaking of edible crosses, let's move on to 7. Tracking and deciphering animal signs for hunting. You see, mountain men didn't have grocery stores. If they wanted to eat, they had to know the land, and more importantly, they had to know the animals living on it. Tracking was survival. It meant the difference between a full belly and starving in the wilderness. And out here, starvation wasn't a slow fade. It was a fast, brutal slide into weakness and death. A good tracker didn't just see a hoof print and think, "Oh, look, a deer passed by." No, he saw the depth of the print, the sharpness of the edges, and knew how long ago that animal had walked through. He read the ground like a book. Every crushed blade of grass, every snapped twig told a story. Following the hoof and paw were prime targets. They fed on grass, shrubs, and low-hanging tree limbs, leaving behind obvious signs such as clipped vegetation, fresh droppings, and bedding areas where they'd flatten grass for the night. Mule deer loved the higher ground, while whitetails stuck to river bottoms and dense cover. If you found fresh droppings still warm, you were close. If they were dry and crumbly, you were wasting your time. Move on. Then there were the predators, the ones that could just as easily hunt you. Wolves and mountain lions didn't leave easy-to-read trails. Wolves moved in packs, spreading their prints out to confuse pursuers, their paths winding in and out of game trails. Now a lone mountain lion. That was worse. A set of large, round tracks with no claw marks meant a cat was nearby, watching, waiting, and if it wasn't afraid of you, well, you had a problem. And you know, sometimes you'd find a carcass before you found the animal. A half-eaten deer meant a predator had been through recently. If the meat was still fresh, maybe minutes ago. If it was just bones and dried skin, days. Mountain men knew better than to steal from a fresh kill. Taking another predator's meal was a good way to become the next meal yourself. Winter made tracking easier, but also more dangerous. Snow preserved tracks well, but it also slowed a man down. Just like outside winter, fresh prints meant fresh game or fresh trouble. Blood in the snow meant either a clean shot had been made or something was already wounded and desperate. A wounded animal could be unpredictable, dangerous, and not just from fear. The smell of blood drew predators fast. Mud, however, told a different story. Soft earth gave away weight, speed, and even if an animal had been limping. Trappers who spent enough time in the backcountry could tell if a deer had been spooked, trotting, or just wandering to a water source. That kind of knowledge wasn't in a book. It was burned into a man's instincts through years of chasing, failing, and chasing again. Once again, this lost art of tracking was all about feeling the land, knowing when something was off. Birds going silent? Something bigger was moving in. A sudden shift in the wind? Your scent was about to give you away. Most people today wouldn't last a week in the mountains. They'd walk past 100 signs without seeing a damn thing. But as for the old mountain men, they survived. They read the wild like a second language. And that made all the difference between hunter and hunted. Learn to track or learn to starve. That was the rule back then. Maybe it still should be. And with everything that's been said, keep in mind that survival isn't learned when you need it. It's too late by then. The wild doesn't care. Either you know or you don't. The frontier chewed up the unprepared. Still does. The weak die. The strong adapt. Which one are you?